Welcome to the Society Pod, a podcast for entrepreneurs, marketers, and leaders. Here's your host, Jessica Yarmy.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Society Pod. My guest today has been a leader and advisor in the franchising space for the last 10 plus years. She's currently the founder and managing director of the Emergent Growth Advisors, which is a boutique strategic advisory firm working at the intersection of franchising and private equity. She's also a columnist for the Franchising Times, writes for Entrepreneur Magazine, as well as a published author. What more can we fit into this introduction? Welcome to the show, Alicia Miller.
Thanks for having me.
How do you introduce yourself? Because you are doing no fewer than 10 things at every moment in the day.
Well, it depends on who I'm introducing myself to, I suppose. I try to keep it relevant to them.
I like that. As I was looking at your LinkedIn, I just kept on scrolling. Like there's all these things that you're currently involved with the IFA, involved with Entrepreneur Magazine, like really everything and anything around franchising. How are you dividing your time?
Well, I don't know that there's such a thing as balance ever in professional life when you're a busy working mom, but I work with a great group of clients and they all have a clear goal in mind. The writing around the side, I think, is a good way for me to talk about trends in the industry. There's a lot of reporting about deals and, growth of different brands and executive movements and things like that. But I've really tried to stay in my lane and focus on the intersection of private equity and franchising and the impact of franchising. So I enjoy that topic and it's easy to write about for me. I hope that it's useful for people.
Well, you've literally wrote the book on the intersection of franchising and private equity. So talk to us about the book and what inspired you to take on that huge project.
So the book was really semi-cathartic from my perspective because I had to wrestle all these themes to the ground myself to understand how I could help my clients because I was getting hired to do strategic consulting and growth consulting, but they all had this end in mind where they wanted to eventually be in a position where they could raise capital with a private equity firm or exit the business. And so it forced me to reverse engineer what are these particular buyers looking for? What do they buy? What do they not like? And how can an emerging brand or even a mid-stage brand prepare for their first institutional capital? Through that research, I kind of built the playbook and then decided that it was something I should put out into the universe so that people could read it and digest it and understand the impact of PE and franchising because it's been nothing short of an earthquake in franchising.
Your book came out this year. It came out in 2024.
March.
When did you start writing it?
It took about a year, evenings and weekends. The rabbit hole I kept going down was all the research because I wanted to double and triple check everything through franchise disclosure documents. I think there's probably another 2 books on the cutting room floor that didn't get into this one. My publisher just kept saying, enough already, enough. Like no more case studies. You've got enough in here. So at some point I might publish the rest of that.
It seems like even from 2023, when you started writing it, to 2024, when you released it, and then even today, now as we're recording December of 2024, the appetite of private equity seems to have shifted a lot in that time. Do you see that kind of similar trend happening in private equity interest in franchising?
There remains very strong interest in high quality businesses, right? So we saw Jersey Mike's trade. He was a long time holdout where he grew it just fine. Thank you very much without PE's help. But, finally Blackstone came in and bought him for $8 billion valuation, which is a tremendous accomplishment. He got almost as much for that business as Subway got, but Subway's a much larger business and in a turnaround situation. So it just proves that great business can get a great valuation and that the appetite is there. This was a slower year for M&A just in general because of interest rates and market headwinds and so on. But I fully expect next year to be very busy. And all of the work I'm already doing to help businesses prepare just demonstrates, and all the touch points I have across private equity and bankers and so on, attorneys are all saying the same thing. Next year is going to be very busy.
I definitely feel that too. There's a lot of energy around and interest around the franchising world. And I know your book speaks to and helps maybe franchisors get prepared for a private equity deal, but can you give us some of the hot topics from your book or the hot advice from your book that's if you are trying to set yourself up for a PE deal, what are some of the top things that you recommend franchisors do?
The number one is unit level economics. If you do not have a high quality offering from the perspective of your franchisees. Can they make money? Can an average franchisee make a decent amount of money and have a good payback for their investment of time and energy and money? Then you've got something. You've got something for franchisees, and you've got something potentially for a buyer down the road. If you don't have that, just full stop. You are not going to find a buyer. They're not interested in that. There's this misconception that private equity firms like turnarounds. They actually don't. They are risk averse, and they have a pretty tight time frame to grow the business and find another buyer upstream. So if you're not coming to the conversation with a pretty high quality offering from the franchisee perspective, no matter what your size is, that's sort of irrelevant. You're not going to find a buyer. And if you're tiny, it's also hard to find a buyer. Emerging brands need to be prepared to go it alone for a while. And I think that's another misconception that I hope the book helps bust a little bit. We're launching 400 brands a year, 500 brands a year into a pretty crowded field. Most private equity firms can't write small checks. So if you're not profitable, or if your EBITDA is really small, there's just a very limited pool of buyers. And so you've got to be prepared to fund the business until you get to royalty self-sufficiency, and then potentially beyond, depending on how long you want to go before you bring in a partner.
Do you define tiny concepts versus small concepts? Do you define those based on royalty self-sufficiency, or do you define it based on a unit count, or how do you kind of break the space into different sizes?
So both. Most PE firms will tell you they won't look at anything below $1 million of EBITDA. It used to be 2 or 3 or 5, depending on the firm. And that's still true. Like a Blackstone can't do a small deal, but more and more of these firms are dipping into smaller brands. But if you think about it from their perspective, a brand that's only got 5 or 10 locations isn't quite proven just yet. You've proven you can sell franchises and you get them open, but they prefer to see more proof of concept, closer to 50 to 100 units open and operating. And the bar for food and restaurant concepts tends to be higher because there's a fear of the restaurant space is overstored in many categories. Until you can prove both that it's a proven concept and that it can operate outside your home market, that there's some expansion potential, it's hard to find that interest.
That's interesting, because I largely play in the fitness space, and I definitely have that 40 to 50 unit count kind of number in my head as I think about like a proven concept. But I've never thought about it through a restaurant term or something like an industry might have a different unit count. Are there any other industries where there might be even a different unit count? Like maybe it's easier to be proven or even harder to be proven than restaurant?
So no, but I think there's a lot of concepts that are sort of easy to open because there's no brick and mortar. And that's a big trend. We're seeing more and more of those brands launch and interest in those brands because it's hard to get a brick and mortar open. It's hard to find real estate. It's expensive. Build outs are more expensive than they used to be. So there's an appetite for that. So the difference there is it's easy to sell a concept that you literally just need a home office and a van to get going. So what they want there is they want to make sure that you've opened a fair number of units and they're sticking. They're not opening and then closing again, that you don't have a lot of churn. Buyers want to see that your franchisees can build reasonable scale in the business as well. A lot of private equity firms don't necessarily want to deal with, 200 pop operators. They like to see that some of those operators can start to build a little miniature empire to drive a higher return on their investment. If every one of them is just operating one territory, that starts to concern them a little bit, because then it starts to look more like a hobbyist or a part-timer than somebody who's really committed to building something bigger.
So you mentioned the Jersey Mike's deal, some of that activity that happened in 2024. What other trends or stories do you look back and say, like, this was an important story or moment in the past year, other than your book launch and the Jersey Mike's deal? Like, what are some of the other big news stories?
One of the big changes this past year was this alignment around broker disclosures. It's not the norm for the International Franchise Association and the AAFD and the CFA, which are the two big franchisee association groups, to align and agree and then march into the state of California and get them to agree on this updated broker disclosure, which I think we'll see that continue to reverberate around, especially the registration states, but also potentially the national securities group that looks at franchising. It just brings disclosures more up to speed and more aligned, I think, around making sure people who are buying franchises understand the role of the person selling them the franchise, that they are in commission, a little bit more about their professional background, because right now they don't have to disclose that. So who is this person who's recommending a business for me to buy? Should they really be someone I should be listening to? And their affiliations, potential prior legal actions, and so on. I think all of that's very positive. The broker space is also crowded. I read somewhere that there's something like 3,000 people who are selling franchises as independently as brokers. The more high quality conversations we can have with people who are really committed to doing a good job of being a professional recommender of franchise businesses. We don't need part-timers necessarily in that gig. We need people who are really committed to it and understand franchising well. So hopefully this disclosure will also clear out some of the noise and make it easier for good people who are doing the right thing to make it a decent living in that function.
I've heard the broker gig be compared to a real estate agent. And I'm like, oh no, it's like so different. And it's so much more important for that person to be an educated, experienced intermediary in those deals. I agree. I think that's going to be a big trend going forward. Are there any other trends that you're watching as we're heading into 2020 that you think like, okay, this is really going to impact either deal flow or the franchising space in general?
I think there's going to continue to be pressure on increased disclosures on franchisors, and their legislation has been submitted again for a second time, I think, in recent memory, on private right of action against franchisors who don't fully comply with the FTC franchise rule around disclosures. I don't know if it'll go through, but I think that theme isn't going away. There's going to continue to be pressure on franchisors to ensure accurate, fair disclosures of what's going on in that business so people can make an educated decision. I think that's a positive thing. M&A is definitely going to pick up, as I mentioned. That's both first-time acquisitions and also, if you think about it, there are a lot of businesses that were invested in prior to the pandemic that have now been held for years. Those need to retrade at some point. PE firms can hold those brands for a long time. And there are some patient capital firms like family offices. And of course, Rourke is the big investor in franchising, and they're a long hold investor for sure. But most of the rest of the players are not looking to hold brands for 20 years. They're looking to hold them for more like 5 or 7. Those brands need to trade, and I think we're going to start to see more of that activity in 2025. I think we're also going to continue to see consolidation inside good franchise systems. It was announced, I think yesterday, that Bain is potentially going to be picking up a large multi-unit franchisee across a number of restaurant concepts. There's still an appetite for being a franchisee, being a private equity investor in a franchisee as an operator. And some of these systems have a lot of legacy owners that want to retire. So we're going to continue to see that for sure in systems with strong unit level economics where you can run it through managers and build the support infrastructure needed to do it right.
I definitely am seeing that in the Club Pilates system that I was a part of for a long time, that there's different PE groups that are coming in and adding funding to some of the largest franchisees. So there's PE on that side. And then there's also like at the exponential level where there's a conglomerate of franchisors or a conglomerate of brands on that side. Do you see the conglomerate trend happening in industries other than fitness? Like I definitely see it happening in fitness. Do you see it in restaurants still, or other concepts or other industries still kind of going in that conglomerate route? And then does private equity like a conglomerate structure, or do they rather have it be a standalone brand?
It depends on the investor. So there are some advantages to having shared back office services, especially in things like tax and supply chain, where you can get a lot of synergies across different brands. But then usually they like to have each brand have its own marketing, its own support team to really understand the nuances of that brand and how to be a good operator in that brand. And it depends on, whether or not they plan to sell that platform as a multi-brand platform, or whether they want to preserve the option of carving out one or two things and selling it out from underneath the platform. If you do that, you've got to keep it separate enough to be able to pull that off. But this consolidation trend also means debt. So if you start buying up units, you're going to fund a portion of that with debt. And I think this next couple of years, we're going to continue to see the high cost of running small businesses, and the debt is still expensive. Interest rates haven't come down as much as we would like them to, lower than some traditional inflation. Of course, it's still expensive to run. And then with headwinds and labor and supply chain costs, it's still going to be, I think, we're still going to see multi-unit franchisees. Many of them are going to find they've just got too much debt on their books. And we're seeing it in the fitness industry. The largest Orange Theory franchisee, I think, probably going to declare bankruptcy because they sort of over-acquired, funded with too much debt.
Yeah, that's an interesting story that I'm definitely watching because that concept as a whole is doing so well. You're like, how does the largest part of that concept fall apart? And maybe some of that falls to the franchisor to like have a better business advisory role to the franchisees. I've never been a part of something where like the largest franchisor has that kind of issue.
It sets up, though, an interesting dynamic when you've got private equity ownership at the franchisor level and at the franchisee level. They have different agendas. They have a fiduciary duty to their investors to make this work. It sets up some pretty interesting tension points. In the case of Orange Theory, that system has not rebounded after the pandemic as well as franchise owners would like it to. That's largely a marketing issue that needs to get solved, not an operating issue per se. But when you've got private equity owners at the franchisee level who need to get a return on their investment, they're going to put a lot of pressure on that management team. I think that's setting up some very interesting dynamic around private equity. When they first came in and bought the franchisor, hadn't necessarily thought all the way through. They can't necessarily prevent PE coming in at the unit level, right? Because at some point, a buyer is a buyer, and you can't prevent necessarily a franchisee from taking on a good buyer. When you have a lot of private equity in your system, they are smart, they are armed with data, and you're going to have to answer to them. If you have a disagreement with an individual franchisee, you can find ways to kind of isolate that franchisee, kind of take them off by themselves and have meetings with them. But as the system starts to consolidate and a large number of your units are owned by private equity and they act as a coordinated block, now you've got a different situation. You can't just isolate. What are you going to do? You got 50 or 60% of your system owned by private equity firms. That's very different.
All of which have really good lawyers behind them. I'm sure you just start to like open up different litigious cultures.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way to avoid that is focus on unit level economics and having a good culture of collaboration with your franchisees. It doesn't have to go to the dark side, so don't let it go there.
Yeah. If we zoom out, what other advice would you have for a franchisor? What do you think franchisors get wrong in franchising?
The root of all problems is they lose their way on the relationship and unit level economics, in my opinion. It's easy to get ahead of your skis and grow too fast and not have the scaffolding also to support those franchisees. So emerging brands need to be careful not to grow too quickly. Really make sure the model is solid and your initial franchisees are happy, good validators, are making money before you turn on the afterburners and start selling faster. Because if you sell too fast and you don't have the support mechanism there, now you're going to stall out. It happens, unfortunately, too often. You might get lucky and get bought, but you're not going to get the value you otherwise would have. They'll end up probably blowing out that management team, bringing in new people. So you haven't created anything real lasting value there. For emerging brands, my advice is be prepared to go it alone for a while and make sure you're building smart from the beginning.
You have no fewer than 7 to 10 roles in the franchising world. So you obviously love franchising and you've given us a lot of like the downsides. Like what are the upsides? What do you love the most about the franchising model?
I love that it gives people the independence that they crave. If you pick the right system for you and your lifestyle and your skills, you can build a great lifestyle that makes you money and gives you the flexibility to do what you want to do in your personal life. That is hard to find in traditional corporate America. It just is. And that's what brought me into franchising initially is I was on airplanes all the time. And I didn't want to be doing that anymore. I wanted to be home more. Franchising allowed me to make that change. I appreciate that many people have this craving to work for themselves. That's just something you don't get that sense of ownership in corporate life that you can get in franchising. So I love that. I also love the franchise community. It really is a community. I don't think I fully appreciated that when I first came in, but I certainly do now. People freely share ideas and support each other, and you learn a lot from watching other concepts. There's just a lot of good people in franchising. It's a huge part of our economy right under our nose. Like you see it all around you, but I drove around for decades not really thinking about franchising until I became a franchisee, and then I saw franchises everywhere. Right? They were there all the time. I just didn't recognize them as such. I saw them as big brands rather than, hey, that McDonald's is owned by a franchisee who lives here in my community.
You talked about your first step into franchising? Like, did you know you were getting into franchising or stumble into franchising?
I knew I wanted to buy a business and work for myself. And I very quickly came to the idea that the franchise model, where there's a playbook and support and other franchisees in the system that you can tap for advice on best practices, was the way to go. I didn't come in looking for a franchise, but I quickly saw the benefits of the franchise model once I started researching businesses to buy.
I love it. My son is 14 now, and he knows obviously about franchising just because I play in the world. As we're driving around, he knows that it's like a McDonald's franchise. He knows that the places are franchised. And instead of being interested in some of the franchises that I play in, he specifically has told me he wants to own and open an iFratelli pizza franchise. He's honestly like done the website research of like how much does it cost to open an iFratelli instead of opening something in fitness, where I would be able to help him. No, he wants to go and be a pizza shop owner. Before we leave the franchising topic, why don't you kind of give us book details? Where can people find the book if they're interested in the franchising and private equity world? Like, where's the best place to buy that book?
So that's on Amazon. It's called Big Money in Franchising. The book is arranged to walk people through the history of how we got here. It breaks down the different types of investors, what they like and don't like, and why they're making the decisions they do. It also talks about how they're compensated individually so that you can understand what their personal motivations are. And then it walks through impact on franchisees, multi-unit. And then if you're looking to prepare for a transaction, provides checklists and things to think about, things to do, things not to do. And then it also walks through what goes wrong. It's not all perfect. When private equity messes up, what are the common reasons why they do and how to avoid those issues? What's the future going forward? I think we're going to continue to see a lot of private equity interest in franchising. It's a great business model. It's here to stay. We just all need to think through what it means for us individually and find the right path for your own objectives.
I love that. And I will share the Amazon link in the show notes, and then I'll share all of Alicia's socials in the show notes so you can follow her as well if you're interested in all these franchising topics. Kind of moving on to you in general, because you're fascinating. Just as many roles as you have had. I'm like digging into your education, and you have at least 7 roles, but then like 7 layers of education. Talk to me about like how you got to all of these different degrees and certifications that you have noted out on your LinkedIn.
I don't know. Maybe it's because I keep changing my mind. I don't know. When I was in college, I thought I wanted to go to law school, but I always had business school kind of in the back of my mind. So God forbid I make a decision right then. No, I just did a double major so I could keep my options open. But clearly, I think that a theme in my life is that I love education. I never stop reading. I never stop learning new things. That's part of what makes you effective long term, is that you can continue to learn new things and immerse yourself. When I came into franchising, I didn't just buy a franchise. I immersed myself in franchising. I studied everything I could. I read every book I could find. I got my CFE, which is the certification. And then I joined the advisory board of the CFE because I was so impressed with the effort the IFA was making in trying to help people learn about franchising best practices. I thought, okay, that's something I can get behind. So that's what led me there. And the book, I guess, is just the latest manifestation of this. It's sort of like a master class in PE and franchising. And since that class didn't exist, I wrote the book and made it myself. That's how I got there.
The interest in law and then the interest in business and then the meeting point of those two things as a FDD document, all of this makes sense now as one big Alicia jigsaw puzzle. With all of the things that you do and that you're involved in, and you have a family, how do you manage your time? Like, do you have like time management hacks for us for how you structure your day?
I'm old school. Everything is in writing. I have a very good friend who makes fun of my calendar. Every time I see him, he opens it up and it's all color coded. I find that method helps me. You think you're busy, you think you're accomplishing a lot, and then you look at the color coding and realize, wow, I did a lot of administrivia today. That's really not moving my business forward. It's not moving things forward. So I try to be very conscious of spending the time on the highest priority things. It's a battle for all of us, right? There's no such thing as balance. You just have to be really disciplined about prioritization and cutting the noise out of your day as much as you can and just staying focused on what matters the most.
I even try to outsource some of those things, and it's so hard to shed the administrative work because at some point it almost is like a foundational organizational moment for me where if I do these easy organization pieces, it's going to unlock the rest of the difficult pieces. If I looked at my color coding, and I don't color code like you do, but if I looked at like where's the most of my time going, it's probably going to things it shouldn't go to. Like it's not at the top earning things that you should be prioritizing. So that's definitely something I want to work on in 2025. Do you have good resolutions set up that you want to share with us?
More of the same. More efficiency. The biggest time suck for me is always research. When people buy the wrong franchise, it's usually because they've shortcut their due diligence. One thing I've learned about private equity is they do not shortcut due diligence. They turn over every rock they can. That doesn't mean they're always perfect or they don't make mistakes of due diligence, because they still do, but they really are very vigorous in their approach to due diligence. So that forces me to reverse engineer that process for my clients to uncover, okay, where are the rocks here? What is a potential buyer going to look at and not find so attractive? Are there opportunities for us to fix that ahead of going into a process, right? So the business is more attractive to them. But that research, looking at competitive set, is very time consuming for me.
Do you feel like the research and the positioning of all of the research is a superpower for you?
No, I think the superpower for me is that, well, I have two. One is I love connecting people. And I find that that's just, it's fun. I enjoy it. I'm good at it. That's a superpower within an industry like franchising, which is already pretty super connected. There's a lot of best practices that can be learned by getting the right people in touch with each other. You benefit from that by having an ever-growing network of friends who, you've helped along the way. I think my other superpower is I'm pretty good at distilling complexity into a straightforward path of, okay, what are we going to do about it? Right. So I can take all that research, and while that takes me a lot of time to think it through, when I get to the point where I'm working with a client, I try to give them a very straightforward playbook.
As you're like the master networker, are there any needs that are on your side that you kind of want to put out into the universe, and somebody listening might be able to connect you with someone? Wish lists that you want to put out there for 2025?
I'm always looking to learn about new brands. There's hundreds of new brands coming online every year, and that's a lot to keep up with. I'd love to know about more brands that have a great concept and are thinking long term. If they've already got that mindset, I'd love to meet them early and be able to help them as they plot their future and hopefully build a great system for them and for their franchisees.
How do you traditionally find those people?
I used to do a lot of outreach. Now I think the script has flipped a bit and a lot more of them contact me. So that's helpful. But going to emerging brand conferences is usually a great way to network with other people in your same situation. And it's the same thing for somebody like me, looking to find people who are looking for that help at an early stage.
Or you can meet them at a happy hour like you and I connected at.
That's right. Those local franchise business network meetings and just local meetups with other franchisees in your city are great. If you're not taking advantage of that, you're missing out. It's a great support system because look, being a franchisee or being a founder is lonely. It really is. That's the downside of working for yourself. So you've got to make some mental health time. The mental health time has got to be a priority too. And that includes networking with other people who can provide you with support and commiserate about some of the issues that you're facing. Who's your bat phone list? Like if you're having a bad day, you've got to have a few people that you can call. Life's too short not to have friends that you can go through it with together.
That call out is so true. And I think you and I met when I was in a low point. And I think the benefit of connecting with you for me was within a 2-minute description of what I was going through, you understood it versus if I connected with somebody else in my network or talked to my family members, it'd be like, let me whiteboard this out for you. Like, here's everything that's happening. And you just don't want to whiteboard it out, but I gave you a, 2-minute overview. Here's where I am. And immediately you were like, well, here's 3 things that you could think about. And I was like, oh, that's actually super smart. So I agree with you where being a founder, building anything, it is lonely, and your network has to keep up with what you're building in order to effectively help you build. I appreciate you calling that out. And I do think it's important if there's founders listening to this, you do need to connect with other founders. You do need to connect with people like Alicia who are super educated in the space. I appreciate you for everything that you share, not just directly with me, but with the community as a whole, in your writing, in your book, everything that you post online. You're such a wealth of knowledge and resources. Is there anything that's top of mind with you that we haven't covered today that you want to dive into?
Franchising is a very unique animal. You've got to build a board of advisors, formal or informal, usually both for most people, who really understand franchising, but also who are outside of franchising. You can be so deep in franchising that you sort of forget the rest of the world. It's important to get some balance there too, if you can. I don't know that most people build out, really sit down and pencil out who is my personal board of advisors that I work with that I can rely on. Are they providing me with the breadth of advice and support that I need? Are there different kinds of backgrounds and experiences in that group? That's really important. And around this time of year, New Year's is a good time of year to just, sit down with a cup of coffee one day and just, who's on my board, my personal advisory board? And am I missing anybody? Should I add an attorney? Should I add a CPA? Should I add somebody outside of my comfort zone or outside of my industry or in an adjacent industry? Because now you're benefiting from all of their networks and their experience. It's sometimes hard to quantify exactly where they're going to help, but the richness of that network and experience can really take you and your business to the next level if you tend to that garden and also try to give back to them as well.
As you look at your personal or professional board of advisors, without naming names, who does that encompass? Like, is it truly like, here's my tax expert, here's my legal? How do you kind of set up your personal board?
Yeah, except mine's like 10 deep. This is the research rabbit hole thing again. I don't have just one attorney. I have like 12 because they all have a different perspective. And I have both the franchisor and the franchisee side. That's very important. I have founders that I tap, operations experts, people outside the industry, especially in technology, kept one foot in tech. And that's really been very helpful for me as well to kind of see where the rest of the world is going. I think that that's really important. And some of them are on the list just because they're good friends. I love talking to them. There's no real business reason for them to be on the advisory board, but yet somehow they still provide sage advice that helps me in my work.
That's great advice. And I'm definitely going to add that to my 2025 resolutions. Thank you so much for everything that you do to support the franchising space, to share value with franchisees, franchisors, and professionals like me who just play in both worlds. You are a wealth of knowledge. And thank you so much for being with us today on the Society Pod.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Society Pod.